So thanks so much, Massimo. I appreciate the really kind introduction, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk here today. So Massimo mentioned my book, Plato and the Nerd, which was published 4 years ago in 2017. And it was really the start of a somewhat crazy project for me, which is, branching out from my usual very technical work. Here's a picture of, hold on. Yeah, here is a picture of one of my typical group meetings these days. I think you're all kind of familiar with this image, but these are researchers that I've been collaborating with fairly intensively on deeply technical software problems. And I'm not going to talk to you today about these deeply technical software problems. I'm going to talk to you about this project that has been more than a side project because it's become a little all-consuming. I'm going to focus on a second book in this vein that I published, which is this one. It's called The Coevolution, which started with the research that I was doing during writing Plato and the Nerd, where I realized that in many ways, throughout my 40-year career working on software for cyber-physical systems, embedded software and the like, I suffered from a delusion that I was really the creator of these technical artifacts that I was working on. And I realized during doing my research in this book that actually I wasn't actually the creator. I was contributor at best. And really the creative process was much more evolutionary than I had thought throughout my career. But anyway, this particular image, one of the things that has happened with the pandemic is that in some ways, I think Juan Carlos mentioned that some research has slowed down. In my case, actually, some of the research has actually sped up. And part of the reason is that I'm collaborating much more intensively with people around the world. People on this screen are in Germany, in France, in California, in Texas, in Turkey, in China, all working together. And also one from the Netherlands. So it's a pretty amazing phenomenon, actually, because before the pandemic, I would be working mostly with people in Berkeley. There's a few other, things that really kind of blew my mind. So last year, the graduation ceremony at Berkeley was held on Minecraft, which I never thought that I would live to see that. We're also learning various ways of interacting that are new to us, and phenomena like this particular image where I'm working one-on-one with one of my PhD students, and notice that we're not making eye contact, and that's because Gil is looking at a second screen. He's looking directly at me on a second screen, but his camera is off to one side. And these kinds of interactions are really changing the way humans are interacting. And I'm fascinated by that process. I think we're learning a lot, as you can see in the conduction of this conference, for sure. So, all right. So let me zero in on the content of this book. The very short, really, that we humans have less control than we think over technology development. I think that one of the phenomena that we're dealing with in the US and actually worldwide is that there's a tendency to kind of blame Silicon Valley for the outcomes that we don't like of technology development. But if my thesis is correct here, that may be really oversimplifying the problem, because it suggests that the implications are that policy is both more important and more difficult to make effective than it might seem. So that's kind of the general theme that I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to give a very nuanced argument. This is not a simple story. Okay, so I ask you to bear with me. And in particular, I avoid the kind of utopia dystopia dichotomy that you see in so many other books. You find all of the books on the screen here are essentially founded on a dystopian view that technology is going to somehow run away in a runaway feedback loop and leave humans in the dust, and we're all going to become irrelevant. That's not what my book is about at all. In fact, I actually don't buy that dystopian picture. I think that there's reasons through our technology development and our adaptation with it. But it's not going to be this runaway feedback loop where we get, the planet gets taken over by these super intelligences. It's also not a utopian book where, technology solves all our problems, and that's not what it's about either. So it's in some ways a much more deeply technical book, and in some cases perhaps more technical than it should be, but also with a bit of a philosophical slant and trying to look at the limitations and the potential of the technology that we have. So one of the key themes in the book is this theme of coevolution, and I coined the term in the book digital creationism for the thesis that technology is the result of top-down intelligent design. So I mentioned that for most of my research career, when I produce a piece of software, for example, which I write a lot of software. People are often surprised that a relatively senior professor here will actually write software, but no, it actually does happen. I used to be proud of the result of that software as my own progeny. It's something that I created from scratch. But that's not really true. The thought processes that were involved in creating that software were very heavily influenced by the properties of the programming languages and the tools that I was using, and also the educational and cultural context in which I was developing that software. And much of the process of software development is actually one of discovery, not invention, in that you try things out and they don't work the way you expected, and you're surprised by the result. And you learn something from that, and the tools guide you in this process. And those tools, of course, are themselves that have been created through a similar process. And so there's this sort of feedback loop of a coevolutionary process where in some ways I am more an agent of mutation than a top-down intelligent designer of these results. So the thesis in my book is that the process of technology development is more coevolutionary. And we may not like seeing our mental cognitive processes as just cogs in an relentless, purposeless evolution, but this might be what is actually going on with technology development. So let's look at a technological artifact. So this is an image of a data center, a rack of computers in a Wikimedia data center. And Wikimedia is the organization that hosts Wikipedia. They have 5 data centers scattered across the globe, and this is one of them. And it looks a little bit like peering into a living thing. You could imagine these wires being nerve cells, and this is sort of the brain of the enterprise. And in fact, I draw an analogy in this book that I work with quite a bit and compare technological artifacts like Wikipedia to living things. So Wikipedia was born about 20 years ago. It's been reacting to its environment ever since. It was born as a single cell organism running on a single server. It grew into a multicellular organism, and it has developed, and it has also propagated because we now see wiki technologies in GitHub, in a lot of other of the frameworks that we use, and many of those are derived from Wikipedia, including snippets of code, which you can imagine are kind of like the genome for, except I call them in the book the codome. These are snippets of genetic material that gets propagated from one of these software beings to another. So in the book, when I first wrote the first draft of the book, I actually, in order to push this metaphor and push this comparison and use it for analysis, I called these creatures, so to speak, living digital beings, which I then shortened to the acronym LDB. And then I started calling them just LDBs. So that was kind of a name that I gave to them. And the publisher hated this. The publisher really didn't want me using the term LDBs. They thought it was a silly term and it would undermine the seriousness of the book. So when you read the book, it uses just a less colorful term and calls them machines, but it does talk about in what ways do they actually resemble biological living things, and how does that inform our interaction with the technologies. So let me relay to you one of the analogies that I talk about. So first of all, I'd like you to imagine what would happen right now if all of the computers on the planet were shut down. It's actually mind-boggling what a calamity that would be for humanity when you think it through. We would lose most of our mechanisms for financial transactions. We would lose most of our mechanisms for communication. We would lose most of our mechanisms for distribution of goods. It would result in billions of people starving. It would be truly a calamity. Okay, I'd like you to imagine now what happens to a human body when the bacteria in that body are suddenly all killed. It is also a calamity for that body. Our gut bacteria are in a very strong symbiotic relationship with humans. They are intrinsic and important in our digestive processes. The gut biome is part of how our bodies work. And if you kill them off, you get quite devastating effects. This does occasionally happen, by the way, as side effects of overuse of antibiotics. You can get disruptions of the gut biome. Usually it doesn't result in all of them being killed off, but it results in a worse scenario where a significant number of them get killed off and then a few rogue species take over, and they can be quite devastating to the patient. Now, I choose that analogy carefully because bacteria are really much simpler bodies biologically. They're not simple, but there's a huge asymmetry. And I believe that that is the state that we're in with technology right now, that the technology is relatively primitive and relatively early stage. I mean, in this computing world, we've only been going for about 40 or 50 years. That's a blink of an eye. And we're going to see things change quite significantly, and the asymmetries may become less asymmetric as the capabilities of the machines improve. To push that analogy a little bit further, I learned in doing research for this book that it turns out that the gut biome has evolved the ability to create proteins that result in the production of hormones that make our brains crave certain foods that are good for those gut bacteria. So the gut bacteria are in fact able to get us to eat the things that they want. I mean, want is not really the right word. There's no desire there in the gut bacteria, but the things that they need for their well-being. Isn't that a bit analogous to what happens in social media, where you post some story on Snapchat, you get a whole lot of likes, and you get this rush of dopamine in your brain that is a reinforcement that makes you want to do more of this. Okay, so that relationship then with the technology is a little bit like this evolved symbiotic relationship where your actions in interacting with that social media platform are promoting the survival and propagation of that social media platform. Okay, so that kind of feedback relationship is a big part of what I study in this book. Now, on this question designs the technology, right? Did Mark Zuckerberg really design Facebook? Well, so here's a picture of me in Stockholm at the Vasa Museum, which is a wonderful place to visit. So this, the ship that's behind me was commissioned by King Gustav II Adolf of Sweden and was launched in 1628. And on the inaugural voyage, there were about 200 high-profile Swedish people on board, and the ship got about a kilometer off the dock and encountered more than a slight and the ship promptly sank to the bottom. And there were about 30 of the 200 people killed. I'm getting a message that my internet is unstable. I hope you're able to hear me. Can I get some confirmation? I'm not talking to myself.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. So this ship, of course, was a badly designed piece of engineering. How did it come about? Well, I'd like to read you a quote from the French philosopher Alain, whose real name was Émile Auguste Chartier. He said, "Every boat is copied from another boat. Let's reason as follows in the manner of Darwin. It is clear that a very badly made boat will end up at the bottom after 1 or 2 voyages and thus never be copied. One could say with complete rigor that it is the sea herself who fashions the boats, choosing those which function and destroying the others." Think about what Alain is saying here about engineering, okay? Are the designers of this boat doing top-down intelligent design? Not really. They're doing mutation of previous designs and experimentation that then resulted in a rather quick learning experience. In fact, there were 4 other boats under construction with the same design when Vasa sank to the bottom. Those 4 other boats were not launched in that form. The design was changed. A significant amount of reconstruction had to be done. They learned very quickly that this was in fact a bad design. But how did they learn this? Did they learn this through top-down intelligent reasoning? No, they learned it by exposing the design to the environment in which it had to operate, which is very much the way Darwinian evolution works. So going back to this theme of the analogy between living things and technological artifacts like Wikipedia. So I'm arguing that Wikipedia is in many ways like a living digital being, and that it has in fact many of the properties that we associate with life. I mentioned it has growth and development. It started as a single cell on a single server, and it's quite a bit larger now. It is able to reproduce, of course, with a tremendous amount of help from human beings, right? Most software requires help from humans to reproduce. The only exceptions, of course, are computer viruses and the like, which we would like to kill off. So, we unleash our antibiotics on them to try to get rid of them. But most software today requires a tremendous amount of help from their human symbionts in order to reproduce. But Wikipedia has been extremely effective at reproducing. Wikis are everywhere, and the technology has propagated and mutated into many other forms. So heredity of traits is also there, as well as mutation of traits. There's also homeostasis, which is the maintenance of stable inner conditions. So the data centers that the Wikimedia Foundation supports have computer-controlled air conditioning systems that maintain steady temperatures. And of course, the chips themselves have voltage regulators that are able to tolerate enormous variations in the power supply that is provided to them from the environment. Now, what about the power supply, right? I mean, many people associate metabolism with being alive, when metabolism is fundamentally deriving energy from chemical reactions. That's in fact where the Wikimedia Foundation servers get most of their energy. In the US, it's mostly from burning natural gas. They have cellular structure and they respond to their environment. So they have all of these properties, which are often associated not with non-living things, but rather with living things. Now, when I was working on the first book, Plato and the Nerd, the first philosophical book, I've written actually several very, very technical textbooks, but these two books, I like to say I have a trilogy of two books, but these two books are much more philosophical. But when I was working on the first one, I learned about this idea of technology being a bit like the emergence of a new life form on the planet. And I learned this from Kevin Kelly. Kevin Kelly was one of the founding editors of Wired magazine and is a technical visionary who is always worth listening to. I mean, and reading, I read everything he writes. It's brilliant. But he coined the term the Technium and said it was essentially the seventh kingdom of life. This actually inspired a really wonderful novel by Dan Brown called Origin, which is all centered around this thesis. But this idea of technology being actually a new life form on the planet was really Kevin Kelly's idea. Now, there's one aspect of it that I don't think Kelly got quite right, because he includes all sort of technological artifacts in his Technium, including things like hammers, nails, musical instruments, like one of his favorite examples is a cornet. I don't think those are living things. And the reason is really, I like the way that Daniel Dennett, the philosopher Daniel Dennett from Tufts, expresses this. When he talks about life, he says, it ain't the meat, it's the motion. And life is a process, not a thing, okay? So Douglas Hofstadter, the author of Gödel, Escher, and Bach, was another brilliant philosopher, commented, he's the one who quoted Daniel Dennett saying this and said it was a somewhat subtle hat tip to a somewhat unsubtle, clearly erotic song that was written in 1951. But the key idea here is life is a process, not a thing. So if you look at Wikipedia, it's not the servers that are alive, it's the software. It's the actual execution of the software that is the thing that is analogous to a living thing. By the way, I don't think it's accidental that Daniel Dennett sports a beard that makes him look rather like Charles Darwin. Here's a picture of the two of them side by side. So we do have software, of course, that is deliberately designed to emulate life. In fact, there's this whole field out there about creating artificial life, or a life, as it's sometimes called. And of course, computer viruses and worms are among the first examples that people think of when they think of artificial life. But there's others like John Conway's Game of Life. By the way, we lost Conway to COVID last year. It was very sad. I was very disappointed to hear that. But these cellular automata, as in the Game of Life, are also, people think of them as emulating living processes in a rather literal way. And one of the goals of a life is to show that you can get very complex behaviors out of relatively simple primitive interactions, but it's very much about the dynamics of these interactions. And so in that sense, this artificial life movement is consistent with Daniel Dennett's perspective that, it ain't the meat, it's the motion. It's the moving thing that makes it living. Now, you might say, well, okay, but software, it doesn't have a lot of the structure that we associate with at least higher animal life forms and plant life forms. We don't have species, for example. There's, much more of a blur between different variants of some particular piece of software. And that's certainly true. But I think, although we don't have a very good understanding of the origins of life on this planet, there's a pretty good chance that in the early stages of the development of biological life, it was just as chaotic and without much structure, without much speciation, certainly without sexual reproduction in the earliest stages. Life was forming as just self-sustaining chemical reactions. That's got to be the first forms of life that we had on this planet, was just chemical processes that could continue. And it's that continuation of the dynamics of the process that makes it the living thing. And we're seeing that with software. And the fact that we have become so dependent as humans on software means that we are going to do everything as a species to continue to keep these software beings alive, because we need them. We cannot feed 7.5 billion people on the planet without the help of these technological artifacts. So I don't want to push this analogy of technology and life too far. And in fact, in my book, I then in chapter 7, go after a counter argument. What is the difference between these software beings and animals, or in particular humans? And here I tie into a principle in psychology that has gained a lot of currency relatively recently. In the last 20 years, this has really gotten a lot of currency in the psychology community, which is called embedded cognition. And I think this is very well expressed by one of the founders of the field, Esther Tellen, who was a developmental psychologist. And she said, the mind simply does not exist as something decoupled from the body and the environment in which it resides. So the idea here is that the cognitive processes, which, the reason that I'm addressing these cognitive processes in this book is, of course, because of the development of artificial intelligence and the huge role that that's playing in technology development today. In what ways does artificial intelligence actually resemble cognitive processes in higher animals, including human beings? And the embodied cognition principle says, okay, a crude analogy that many people use is that the mind is software executing in the brain, reacting to stimulus provided by the senses, and then generating motor controls for the actuators of the body. And Esther Tellen says that's dead wrong. That is not at all what the mind is. The mind is the interaction between the brain and its environment. It's that interaction that is the mind, not some process within the brain that is then doing I/O with its environment. Okay, so there are people in the technological world who have started to explore this idea of embodied cognition. So here's a wonderful robot constructed by Josh Bongard and his team. And this robot is not pre-programmed to be able to locomote. It can't move around, all right? But it is programmed with the goal of being able to move. And it learns. It starts experimenting with its limbs, much the way a newborn child experiments with their limbs. And it eventually learns to be able to move and get around. But more interestingly, it's actually adaptive. You can yank off one of the legs, and the robot will flounder for a while, but it continues to learn, and it learns then to walk on 3 legs. You can attach a weight to one of the legs, changing its dynamics, and it will continue to learn to move around. So this idea of a interaction between the technology and its environment being part of the essence of the technological being is this idea of embodied cognition. And I would say that in the development of AI and software technology more broadly, we're doing very little of this today. We're just starting to do technologies that kind of resemble this idea of embodied cognition. This is what the whole field of cyber-physical systems is about. Now, on this question of the differences between the software technology and higher cognitive life forms, one of the things that I confront in this book is the question of whether our cognitive processes are digital and algorithmic at their root. And there's many people who believe very fervently that they are. And in fact, there's a whole cult community that is convinced that immortality is attainable in the near future, because we're going to be able to figure out how to upload our minds, that if they are, after all, just algorithms running on digital data, then in principle, they could be replicated. So the philosopher Hilary Putnam talks about the ability to, he calls it multiple realizability, that if you have a process that can be perfectly replicated in another piece of hardware, then there is no distinction between the original process and the new process. So is that really the case? Are we going to be able to upload our minds and therefore achieve some form of immortality? Of course, closely related to that is, this is an image from a Star Trek episode. This is the transporter in Star Trek, right? If in principle it's possible to do uploading, if we can digitize ourselves, then we can transmit our digital selves and reconstruct it somewhere else. So this question, of course, relates then to the question of whether AIs will be able to replicate humans, at least AIs that are running on hardware that is distinctly different from the hardware of the human, right? That they're silicon and wires, they're not neurons. So this question turns out to be a rather hard question at a fundamental level. But in the book, I argue that this tenet, which I borrowed the term from Yuval Noah Harari, the dataism term that he coined, for this faith. And I show in the book that it's actually a faith. It's not a scientific principle, and it can never be a scientific principle. And the way that I show this in the book is to rely on a famous theorem developed by Claude Shannon, which is the channel capacity theorem, which shows that a noisy channel cannot convey more than a finite number of bits of information. And so in order for uploading or teleportation to be possible, theoretically, it must be that the essence of a human being is captured in a finite number of bits, that the essence of yourself must be representable in a finite number of bits. There are people, very well-respected people, who believe that this is actually true and believe this from fundamental scientific principles. And I confront that and show in the book that the hypothesis that our essence is representable in a finite number of bits is not falsifiable by experiment. You cannot construct an experiment that has the potential of falsifying that hypothesis. And hence, by the philosophy of science of Karl Popper, you would have to reject this hypothesis as a non-scientific hypothesis. This inability to construct experiments means that it's fundamentally not a scientific principle, and you can only take it on faith. Now, you might say, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this, because we know as computer scientists that we know how to build a universal machine, right? We know how to build a Turing machine, which many people misunderstand as a universal machine. Is a Turing machine really a universal machine? Can it do what my dishwasher does? Okay. I want to point out that Turing machines are algorithmic. What does that mean, really? Well, an algorithm is a discrete sequence of steps that terminates. Okay, well, I mean, an algorithm in general doesn't have to terminate, but to be a valid Turing machine, it has to terminate. Okay, Turing machine is also digital. It's operating on discrete data. So this discreteness of the process and this discreteness of the data that it operates on are essential features of this universal machine. Are machines in the physical world limited to being algorithmic and digital? Some people believe they are, but by the Shannon channel capacity theorem, that belief is not falsifiable by experiment, and it's not well supported by our understanding of physics. In fact, almost all accepted theories of physics involve continuums of time processes and data, and they don't discretize things. This is true even of quantum mechanics, despite the name quantum, okay? And so I talk about this in some depth in the book, and I confront this hypothesis and show that it's ultimately a faith and that Turing machines are not, in fact, universal machines at all. There's another troubling thing that might make you resist this, where that, DNA is fundamentally digital. That's actually true, right? DNA is a DNA molecule. Its essence is completely encoded in a finite number of bits. Okay, a human DNA takes about 2 gigabytes of data, which is, piece of cake with today's technology, right? I can store many hundreds of human DNA on the laptop that I'm talking on right now in its main memory, and many more in on the hard drive. Okay, so so doesn't this mean that humans must be at their essence actually digital and discrete, because it's a finite number of bits in the DNA? But I would like to point out that every human alive today is the endpoint of a continuous, unbroken biological process dating back about 4 billion years. So when I ask you how old you are, okay, think about that question a minute, because we have this convention of counting our age as the time since we emerged from our mother's womb. But if we count our age as the time since our biological process started, the process of self-sustaining chemical reactions, we're all about 4 billion years old, okay? That process, if it had any interruptions anywhere in there, we wouldn't be here, okay? That process is a continuous process that carries an enormous amount of information. In fact, so much information that my contention is we have no reason to believe that that information is digitally encodable. Wait a minute, there's got to be another argument that will work. Well, let's look at neuronal structures, right? So here's an image of some neurons constructed with Golgi's method, which actually gives a very misleading picture of the brain. Golgi's method is effective because it stains a tiny fraction, about 0.1% of the neurons in a slice of brain. And as a consequence, you can pick them out and separate them from their environment. But yeah, neurons fire discretely. McCulloch and Pitts in the 1940s discovered this and postulated that neurons combine to realize logic functions, and that logic functions can be realized on other hardware. If we can just understand the connections between neurons and understand how these logic functions work, then we would be able to decode the digital and algorithmic processes of the brain. Okay, that's the hypothesis. That hypothesis has become part of the life career of Jeff Lichtman at Harvard, who is a brilliant researcher who has done a much more detailed physical study of brain structure using some extremely clever techniques. So this is what the image shows here, a 3D reconstruction of a single neuron, which is that orangish structure around it that are interacting with it. And the whole study of the interconnection between these neurons. And the principle was that he was hoping that by understanding these connections, we would be able to understand brain function better. His conclusion is we can't. the complexity of the interaction of the structure is such, and the chaotic nature of it is such, that just understanding connections, understanding the wiring diagram is not going to tell us much about how the brain actually results in cognitive functions. And so things are a lot harder than they look. This simple picture, based on McCulloch and Pitts, ignores an awful lot of what happens in a nervous system. For example, it ignores timing. Neurons don't just realize logic functions. They realize logic functions in a dynamic process that has timing. And the timing of these logic functions matters a lot. And there's no reason to believe that these are digitally clocked as they would be in a computer. So that all of this tells us that the technology out of which we're building AIs is really pretty different from the way that human minds are constructed. And consequently, we should expect the technology to lead to, if it does lead to cognitive processes, they're going to be pretty different cognitive processes from the ones that humans have. So how much should we treat them like humans, for example? So should we hold AIs accountable for their decisions, right? That's one question that's sort of a hard philosophical question. So I turned this question around in the book to say, well, most of the time when we ask about accountability, we say, well, if a self-driving car, hits a pedestrian, do we hold the AI in the car responsible? Do we hold the manufacturer of the car responsible? Do we hold the owner of the car responsible? Okay, so that's all about bad things that can happen with the technology. What about good things? Should we give credit to an AI for the production of an artwork? So this particular piece of artwork is a painting. It's not painted with a brush, it's actually printed on an inkjet printer that sold at the Christie's auction house for $432,000, surprising everybody. Now, this was created by a group of 3 artists. Pierre Fautrel is one of the artists, and this is a picture of him standing next to the painting. And they call their group Obvious, and they represented this as the first artwork created by an AI. And this particular artwork was created using an AI technology that's called Generative Adversarial Networks, or GANs, that was originally developed by Ian Goodfellow. The particular software they used to create this particular work was written by a high school student, Robbie Barrett, who himself is quite an artist and has used his own software to create really quite marvelous images. I think Robbie Barrett is now a student at Stanford, or maybe he's already graduated from Stanford. But at the time that he created this software, he was a high school student. So the artists, Pierre Fautrel and his 2 colleagues, stood back and said, well, this really isn't our work, this is the AI's work, okay? But to whom should we really give credit for it? Should we give the Obvious trio credit? Should we give the AI credit? Should we give Ian Goodfellow credit? Unfortunately, with art, often, we tend to want to give a single individual credit for that artwork, even though every artwork is the result of cultivated cultural interaction and is an evolution from previous artworks. And so accountability is actually a rather complex story. And the question of whether we should give AIs credit for their constructions or blame for their errors brings that question of accountability to the foreground. And maybe we can learn something about accountability in humans by studying that question with respect to AIs. Now, that question, it was proved to be interesting enough to me to really lead me down a path that I never expected to go while I was working on this book. And the next 3 chapters after this one get quite technical. on this question of accountability, responsibility, and whether we should hold AIs accountable for their actions. So here I draw on some work that was quite unexpected to me. So one is, in order to understand the question of accountability, you have to reason about causation. What caused the result? Okay. If you can't reason about causation, you can't assign accountability or blame for anything. Okay. It turns out that there's a whole community that has been questioning whether causation, the notion of causation, is a human evolved cognitive construct versus a principle of physics. And excuse me, one of the most famous proponents of this question of whether it is Bertrand Russell, who in 1913 confronted the question. He said, the law of causality, I believe, like much that passes muster among philosophers, of a bygone age, surviving like the monarchy only because it is erroneously supposed to do no harm. So he points to things like the physics of the celestial body movements and says there's nothing in that physics that talks about causes. Okay, there's no causes in the mathematics. It's not that the motion of one planet causes the motion of another. That's not the way it works. The formulas express relationships between motions, not causation. So maybe as a physical principle, it's not, causation itself is not fundamental. So I also draw on the work of Judea Pearl, who is a Turing Award winner, who has shown that reasoning about causation requires first-person subjective involvement, that it is in fact impossible to reason about causation without actually interacting as a first-person subjective agent. Okay, this is a very subtle but very deep argument that Pearl has developed. And so the question then of whether the machines should be held accountable is dependent on the question of whether the machines will be able to develop a first-person subjective self. So in the book, I dive into in some detail what it means to develop a first-person subjective self. And I show that if you look at the most primitive biological entities, I look at one of the favorite neuroscientist subject of study is a very simple worm that has a nervous system that has only about a couple hundred neurons. And it turns out that this worm already has the ability to distinguish self from non-self, even with just a couple hundred neurons. And I also show in the book that certain machines have this ability to distinguish self from non-self as well. So they have a protoform of a first-person subjective self already, which means that they might be starting to develop the prerequisites to be able to reason about causation eventually, which means that we might in fact find ourselves in a situation where we will need to hold them accountable. I then went in much more detail, and I will not give you the details here. You really need to read the book, but the chapter 12 is the hardest chapter in the book, and it draws on the results of 3 other Turing Award winners, Robin Milner, Silvio Micali, and Shafi Goldwasser. And the essence of this chapter is that it shows that interaction is actually more powerful than observation, and it's actually more powerful than computation. And so interaction does things that Turing machines cannot do. And interaction is essential to being able to reason about causation. About that, and then just give you a quick view of the 2 remaining chapters. So chapter 13, this, by the way, is not a map of the spread of the pandemic. It's the spread of a different pandemic. This was mapping the spread of the WannaCry ransomware internet worm that in 2017 was released and took over machines worldwide and encrypted their disks. And of course, these ransomware attacks are now very much in the news. This was a machine pandemic in 2017. My claim in the book that these are the kinds of problems that we will face with technology development, and that these are pathologies. They're not an adversarial confrontation between an alien invasion of an AI species and humanity. That war of the worlds kind of picture that so many of these doomsday books give, of the runaway super intelligence taking over the world, and we are going to be fighting it as an alien species invading our planet. That's science fiction. Okay, what we're going to have instead is illnesses that arise in our symbiotic relationship with technology. And we should treat these as illnesses, as pathologies, and learn to develop it, for example, in order to protect ourselves against these illnesses. In this partnership with machines, I personally find humans far scarier than AIs, and humans wielding AIs are particularly scary because it's a very powerful technology. So I'm running low on time, but I'd like to just spend a couple minutes on this question of coevolution. So are we really co-evolving with the technology as opposed to doing top-down intelligent design? Well, in researching this book, I learned a lot about evolution, about Darwinian evolution as viewed in modern times, which as itself as a field evolved a lot since Darwin. I really recommend this wonderful book by David Quammen called The Tangled Tree, which it gives a very good view of a modern perspective on evolution. And I used to think, in fact, I was taught in school, that evolution was random mutation followed by natural selection. So the random mutation in DNA would occur because an alpha particle hits a DNA, or chemicals in the environment have some effect on the DNA, and it would just be completely random, and you'd get a new DNA, which would then either survive in the environment or not. Turns out that random mutation followed by natural selection cannot explain simple things that we see every day. So the speed with which bacteria develop a tolerance to antibiotics cannot be explained by that random mutation followed by natural selection. The development of antibiotic resistant bacteria would be much slower if those were the primary mechanisms. So I'm not a biologist, and so I did a lot of research to try to convey to non-biologists how this works and what we can learn about it in terms of what analogies we can draw between biological evolution and technological evolution. So one of the innovations that is relatively recent is this understanding of horizontal gene transfer, which apparently plays a very significant role in the development. They're extremely common, okay? And thankfully they're extremely common, or we would be overwhelmed by bacteria. But it turns out that these viruses, when they invade a bacterial cell, can end up carrying away pieces of the DNA of that cell, and then they invade another cell and splice in pieces of the DNA into that other cell. Well, this is what a software developer does. Okay, no software developer starts with a blank slate and builds a program from scratch. A software developer takes pieces of codome from here and there, the standard template library, the Java component library, the Python modules, JavaScript modules, looks on Stack Overflow for how other people have combined these things, looks on GitHub for pieces of code to grab, and puts together all these pieces of code to create a new technological So this is, I think, a very good analogy. This is much more like the process of of how software development works. There's also another, like so many good ideas, but Margulis was the first person to really put this on a sound scientific basis, which is this idea of symbiogenesis or endosymbiotic theory. And it's an evolutionary theory for how the cells in plants and animals, which are relatively complex cells compared to bacterial cells, how those came about. And the argument in this thesis is that they didn't come about through random mutation. They came about through symbiotic merging. So imagine one bacterium ingesting another, and instead of digesting it, making it part of its system, okay, to create a new entity, which is now a combination of these two previous entities. And we see this happening with humans and their interaction with technology. And in fact, to some degree, we already are cyborgs. Our cognitive processes are tied up in our computers in an intrinsic way. And one way that I'd like to emphasize this is, a question people like to ask is, will computers like to learn to write their own programs? Well, I'd like to point out that computers today teach humans to program. That when you use the software tools to develop software, those software tools are teaching you how to program. And the tools have been getting continually more sophisticated and more effective at teaching you to program. My productivity as a software engineer is orders of magnitude higher than it was just 20 years ago, because the tools are able to guide me so much more effectively and teach me what I need to do. So, applications. Well, under digital creationism, bad outcomes are the result of unethical actions by individuals. For example, individuals who blindly follow the profit motive with no concern for societal effects. Under coevolution, bad outcomes are the result of procreative prowess. Technologies that succeed are those that more effectively propagate. These are completely different, almost opposite explanations of how technology develops. If we base policy on digital creationism, my claim is it's unlikely to be effective, okay? Because digital creationism is not what's happening. So in conclusion, we nudge rather than control technology development. We change as technology changes. And only if we develop a deeper understanding of these coevolutionary processes can we have any hope of effective policies that ensure that technology serves humanity. So thanks very much. I'll stop there.